Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast that is normally dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. This time around, though, we're going to bring forward a bonus episode on one of who is probably the most cross-referenced authors, or at least discussed authors on this show, from a perspective of, if nothing else, me just bringing his name up, and in the community of broader Pynchon readers. We are talking about David Foster Wallace, and this sort of episode has its origins in Johan coming back onto the show and being pretty interested in Wallace generally. We discussed that with him a little bit last time he came on. In that intervening space, Cody, who is unfortunately not going to be able to make it to this episode, did read Infinite Jest, and so kind of had the idea of having Johan come back and then discussing the author's works sort of in a more broader discussion than maybe the couple of different ways that it was brought up in our previous episode. So yeah, I guess maybe the easiest way to start out with is, what is our level of familiarity with Wallace? How much of his work have we read? And then maybe how we got into them. Does someone want to kick that off?
So I've read everything by David Foster Wallace in book form, except for the book on infinity, like his college thesis or whatever, that was later turned into a book, and the book on hip hop. I used to own the book on hip hop. I did try to read it, and I have very little familiarity with 80s rap, and so all of the I didn't recognize any proper nouns in the introduction and stuff, and it's a little kind of, he co-wrote it, but I'm not, it's two white guys talking about rap in a very intellectual way, so I just wasn't into it. I believe I was introduced to David Foster Wallace through the Time list of best books, best novels from 1920 to 2005 or something. That's a list I used to read a lot in college. That's how I was introduced to Gravity's Rainbow and Pynchon, I think, as well. I did my undergraduate thesis because my undergraduate degree is in English literature, so my undergraduate thesis was comparing Don DeLillo's End Zone with Infinite Jest, specifically the kind of gamification of nuclear war and the comparisons between nuclear war and stuff like tennis and football in those two novels. And growing up, my dad had a copy of Infinite Jest in his bookshelf. It's a big book, kind of draws your eye. I don't believe he ever read it. I had an uncle who also owned, I think, 2 copies of it that I inherited about 10 years ago from him because he passed when he passed. So I at one point owned, I think, 4 copies of it, including one first edition. Owning four copies of Infinite Jest it was at least 3. I'm pretty sure it was 4. It was a bit ridiculous, but yeah, we'll get into this a little bit more, but I do somewhat regret reading so much by David Foster Wallace for a few different reasons, but we'll get into that later.
Interesting. As far as when I first became aware of his writing, that's pretty hard for me to pinpoint. Because like you had mentioned, Luke, his work, Infinite Jest especially, but not just Infinite Jest, shows up on lists all the time from a perspective of the essential books to read, the best English language novels. It's one of these books that is constantly in the discussion of sort of stuff you should read before you die, or the most important stuff ever published. So I was certainly aware of the book Infinite Jest for a very, very long time. I think I probably became more aware of David Foster Wallace as a human being, disconnected from the book Infinite Jest through actually the movie The End of the Tour. I think that intellectually I knew that he had written Infinite Jest, but didn't really know anything about him as a person. And then was super fascinated by that movie. It's an early A24 film. And so I had seen it when it had come out, just because I like the trailer was interesting, and conceptually what it was pitched as sounded interesting to me. And then that kind of was what put the book onto my radar, as far as, I should probably actually read this, not just because of the fact that it's considered like a classic or considered something that you should read, but what this guy has to say, given that most of those quotes in that movie are taken directly from interviews done between the 2 characters of it that took place in real life. Given how interesting I found what he had to say, I thought maybe I should actually give the book a try. And then kind of didn't start there because obviously that's intimidating. I started, as most people do, with the "This Is Water" commencement speech. I listened to that, and then I had read a couple of individual essays of his, and then eventually picked up Infinite Jest after that, and found time to read it in COVID because I was an essential worker, and as a result of that, I still had to go to work every day, but nobody else was coming into where I worked. So I had a lot of downtime and managed to read it in about 2 months, from like April to June of that year. And that not only broadened my like reading horizons, but it made me make a lot of major life decisions afterwards, obviously, as well, which obviously we can get into later on. So I read that and then immediately jumped into like a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again right after that, and then The Pale King and Oblivion, and similar to Luke, have now read everything. I have a copy of his mathematical thesis somewhere. Um, I bought it on a whim, and then in an interview that he did with, I think maybe Lawrence Lopate, he mentioned that it wasn't very good and that it was sort of a representation of a different life path he could have went on. So it's been at the back burner of like my whole shelf of books to read. Just because if the man himself isn't all that interested in what he has to say there, then neither am I. Um, and yeah, that's pretty much my sort of path into his work.
I can say that I am also one of those not read Signifying Rappers and the math book. I also haven't read the first book, actually, Bloom of the System. But other than that, I read it all, and Infinite Jest and Pale King several times, and Oblivion is also one of those books I feel I've read countless times, not back to from to finish, but reading different stories. I think first book I bought was Infinite Jest, and a British, very ugly paperback edition in the late 90s. Ugly because it's very small in size, so it's virtually unreadable, I think. And that probably was one of the reasons I didn't read it, because the print was just too small, and that is intimidating by itself. And so I was in my very, very late teens, early 20s, as a literary student in Trondheim, Norway. And it just sat on my shelf as something I didn't know very much about. And a couple of years later, I became friend with this guy when I moved to Oslo, and he not only was he a big fan or reader of Wallace's, amongst others, but he had also actually interviewed him in February of '98, I think, in Illinois, and he also became later the Norwegian publisher of both Wallace and like William Vollmann and a few others. I think it was through him that I actually started reading him, and many others, my first experience was reading a supposedly fun thing. And then I think of the fiction, actually, the first one I read was The Pale King. That was my entry point to him as a fiction writer. And I think prior to Wallace's death in 2008, I was pretty much just reading the nonfiction. I'm not sure why. Maybe it again has something to do with being a little bit intimidated or something. But I remember bringing a copy of Pale King to a vacation in Italy, and just lying on the beach and reading about people being extremely bored at their work. And that's where I first fell in love with both the writing and the style, but also the themes, I guess. And then pretty soon after that, I felt that I was ready to handle Infinite Jest, and that became one of the, if not the most important books I ever read, I think. in terms of showing me what is possible to do with literature, and still 30 years later, I'm super impressed by just the achievement, not the length, because as we talked about in one of the other episodes, writing a very long book is not that difficult by itself, but writing a level of quality for 1,000 pages plus endnotes, it still baffles me.
Yeah, especially to pull off a lot of the grammatical stuff that he does in that book too.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that leaves me. I, on the other hand, contrast to everyone else here, have not read any of Wallace's work. My awareness of him was first shaped by the general kind of post mid 2000s, like I don't know, I don't have the right word for this, but kind of boogey-manification of him. He as I grew into an aware being, I was swiftly made aware of this weird guy who walked around, who was about the age of my parents, walking around with a bandana on his forehead, who some people treated like he was some sort of second coming of Jesus, and others treated as some sort of a dilettante and marker of affectation, I guess. And so the reason I'm here for everyone who's listening and confused by someone who isn't familiar is here, because there need to be goals set for everything, including conversation. And I am here to make sure that there's a goal for this one, which is convince me to read Infinite Jest. I don't need to prove anything to the world. I've read long books. Pshaw, I say. I've read Zadie Smith. I've mocked Jonathan Franzen. I've read Pynchon and DeLillo. Why should I read David Foster Wallace? End of statement.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to start with that question? Why should you read David Foster Wallace?
No, I think a better way to start this might be what does he mean to y'all? What does his writing mean to all of you?
Yeah, that is a good question. For me, I will not deny there is part of me that is wrapped up in his work is due to the fact that it represented a pretty big sea change in my life. This is not something that I talk about very much on the podcast, but I am an intersex person, and it took over 20 years of my life to learn that, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is a very confusing thing to suddenly come into contact with when you are already sort of a fully developed human in your own mind. And part of that process that sort of led me to that place, as far as like going and seeing a doctor and asking questions about like why it is that I was sick so much as a kid and why my body developed weirdly and stuff like that, was because to me the big question of Infinite Jest, or the big sort of overarching theme that everything else is contained within, is this concept of asking the reader, like, are you actually a happy person, or have you convinced yourself that you're a happy person due to one of any number of sort of instant gratification inputs that you could do, or that you could sort of put the name in there for you as a placeholder. And it prompted a lot of questions in me, as it should, I think, anyone who comes to the book, about like why it is that I felt uncomfortable in my life circumstances at that point, or why it is that I was maybe not as happy as I expected to be as an adult, which then led me to actually like finding a good physician, and then asking those questions that I had had since I was a kid, and then finally learning, why it is that that I had a lot of developmental challenges, and then sort of going down the process to actually become like a healthy, well-adjusted, like happy adult, right? So I understand that a big part of my emotional investment in Wallace and Infinite Jest is because it is sort of the gateway to that aspect of my life, and then sort of everything that has come post reading it. But I think that on a broader sense, what his work means to me is it's the clearest possible writing that I've come across from the 1990s that diagnoses a lot of the reasons for why things in the modern world are kind of shit, and what it is that people can do to get out of it, or at least questions that they should ask themselves to examine why the world. And he was able to kind of create a philosophy of fiction across both his fiction work and nonfiction work. That, or I should maybe say philosophy of writing, that I think everybody could benefit from, but that most people maybe won't, either because they won't read it or because they won't, undergo the process of examining themselves afterwards, or seeking out his interviews or other sort of supplementary material um, to kind of understand what that philosophy was. But his principles of sincerity and earnestness, and his sort of understanding of technology and where that was headed, and the internet and where that was headed, and eventually sort of adult life and kind of making peace with your working life. All of those things I think are very important to just being a human being. And I appreciate that there is a body of work that exists that is able to prompt those questions within me, prompt those thoughts within me, but is also fun. Like David Foster Wallace is just like a fun author to read. He's very funny while being insightful, and is able to accomplish things like Johan mentioned that very few writers are able to. And so there is that additional sort of aspect of kind of being in awe of reading a master at work. That's what I would say his work means to me.
I completely agree with all of that. I think for me, the thing I noted down and prior to this was, me reading Wallace is both comfort and inspiration. By comfort, I mean that I think especially in books like Infinite Jest and The Pale King, how he is able to describe not just the human condition, but sadness or depression, for instance, how he's able to articulate that in those things that really doesn't have a language. For instance, I can't say that I have very much personal experience with depression. I do have had one or two bouts of anxiety in my life, and that sort of borderlines it a little bit in the way that it's very, very difficult to explain to someone else what having an anxiety attack feels like. It's not like it's not that you're afraid or anything, but and there's this, for instance, this place in Infinite Jest where the character Kate Gompert tries to explain in regards to her severe depression that the problem is not that she doesn't know that it's going to go over as it usually does. It's while you are depressed, have this feeling that it will never go away. And I can relate to that in a sense that when you do have, for instance, an anxiety attack, your mind tricks you into believing that, okay, maybe you've had this before and it went away, but this time it's for real. This time it's going to stay forever. And now you're for the first time ever seeing the world as it really is, etc., etc., etc. So it's completely overwhelming. And it's impossible to describe to anyone over the phone or trying to get comfort from anyone, because it's all inside you in a very, very lonely way. And I think that in both Infinite Jest and to some degree in The Pale King and definitely in Oblivion, is able to articulate that in a way that makes it, hopefully for those really suffering from, say, depression, livable in a way, which is strange given the fact that we all know how Walter's life ended. But still, I find great comfort in that, because I think the way he writes, and he mentioned this himself in a couple of interviews, is him trying to. He speaks like a friend late in the night, just talking to you, and it's a very, very intimate tone, I think, and also, I think as a Norwegian or as a non-American, it's also interesting because, in one sense, David Foster Wallace is, I think, a very, very American writer. and he was also a writer who didn't travel a lot, etc. But it's enormously relatable, not only to me, but I've listened to all this podcasts where people from all over the world talk about him, and they all have this sense of connection. So on one side, it's a very American writer, and on the other side, it's a very general writer, I think, because he's able to plug into those things which are really, really how we feel, and I think that all culminates with the now very famous "This is Water" speech. That makes any sense for anyone?
Yeah, that speech really does sum up a lot of the purpose behind the writing, I think.
Let me just add this also. I think not only that he talks about sadness, but he admits what we all really already know, but he talks about it in a great way, that life is hard. And what Kate talked about just now is also one of those things. All these hardships we have to go through in order to find ourselves and accept ourselves and do the changes we need to do in our own life to not only be happy but to be able to fight for another day. And I think though it's sometimes really, really sad and sometimes, of course, extremely funny, there's a lot of hope, I think, in there, which I find really, comforting. And then, of course, there's the other thing for me as a writer, that it's just very, very inspirational to see a writer being able to go as deep as it sometimes does. I mean, like for instance, at the end of Infinite Jest, where Gately is at the hospital and is able to describe space between 2 seconds. I think this is a wonderful passage. I don't have it in front of me, where Gately just trying, the pain are so severe. He's trying to fight from 1 second to another, and it's like he writes about how a second is sort of surrounded by walls protecting him from the next second, and then he's able to go into the next second, and so on. Now, just if you read good literature, be it Wallace or whoever it is, it propels you in a creative way, I think, in much the same way as we can say about Pynchon and other writers, but it propels you in a way that it gives me the urge to go to my desk and at least attempt to do something.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. There are many times where I've gone back to revisit like passages of Infinite Jest or the supposedly fun thing I never do again, or especially Pale King, and just reread through them just because I know it'll spur me towards a desire to pick up the pen myself. And I do like what you said about the kind of perseverance angle, or the idea of like the struggle and the hardship is worth it because of what's on the other side. And there's a line in Infinite Jest that I repeat to myself whenever I'm in a situation like that, where he says, "No single moment was unendurable or is unendurable," and just reducing sort of truths down to something easily digestible like that, but that prompt big introspection or large thoughts is a huge part of his work.
Yeah, so I used to feel very similarly to y'all whenever I was going through his work, in that I was, kind of astounded by how deeply and thoughtfully Wallace portrays stuff like anxiety and depression. I struggled a lot with anxiety and depression in my late teens and in my 20s. Especially during my college years, I was pretty anxious and depressed and stuff. That was around when I first read Infinite Jest, and it had a big effect on me. And just generally, I find Wallace's work to be very emotionally affecting. And that's kind of maybe leads into why I somewhat regret reading everything by him, or almost everything. I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with the fact that I have very complicated feelings about David Foster Wallace, where I was a pretty massive fan of his for a long time, and then that kind of changed after I kind of let his work. I'm still a fan, I would say, but that kind of changed after I kind of let his work like kind of marinate inside my brain for a while. Because I read DT Max's biography of David Foster Wallace like at the tail end of my like Wallace binge, and I don't know how much we really want to focus on this kind of stuff in this episode. But DT Max does kind of get into how David Foster Wallace had a kind of problematic relationship with Mary Carr, more than a little problematic relationship with Mary Carr. And I do have a small connection to Mary Carr. Like my dad was around her some in the '90s because I used to live in Syracuse, New York. That's where Mary Carr still lives, but she was living there at the same time. Actually, David Foster Wallace was living there in the early '90s while I was living there. I don't think I ever, obviously ran into him or anything, and I was, too young to even realize who he was. And I don't think my dad ever ran into him either. My dad, kind of tangentially knew Mary Carr. Like, they met a few times at parties and stuff. I think my sister met Mary Carr one time. And I just remember thinking, like, whenever I was reading that stuff about David Foster Wallace, treating her so problematically, I remember feeling at least somewhat betrayed just because he comes to like whenever you're reading David Foster Wallace, you're thinking to yourself, like, this guy, like, he has it all figured out. Or you like I was young then, that was 10, like I read my last David Foster Wallace probably 9 or 10 years ago, and I haven't revisited it. But I had a very like elevated view of him whenever I was reading him, where I was like, this guy like describes my depression and anxiety so well. This guy like is such a virtuosic writer, all this stuff. And then finding out that his personal life was less than perfect, much less than perfect, kind of really fucked with me a lot there for a bit. And then later in the late 2010s, Mary Carr kind of came forward about that stuff a little bit more, and there's other allegations against David Foster Wallace, and that kind of I don't know. Like I said, I have a very complicated relationship with him, where like I do feel like he's a very like he's a very he's one of the in terms of talent, pure like writing talent, he's like one of the maybe the best of his generation, I would say, in terms of just pure like talent. But I feel like his chosen subjects kind of like I don't know, if I were him, I guess, and I just wouldn't have tried to come across as super sincere and all this stuff if I knew I wasn't going to be able to back that up with my personal life, I guess, where like I don't know. I'm not I'm kind of struggling with how to put all this into words, but his writing still does mean a lot to me. There are short stories that I've read by him, especially in Oblivion, and particularly the story that's about I believe it's a woman who like is really struggling with like calling other people too much to complain about her life, and like the line between like needing support and being too much of a burden. That story has really stuck with me. And also that's that also kind of plays into what I was just kind of talking about, in that I somewhat regret reading that story because it's such a visceral portrayal of like being in crisis mode and like needing somebody to be there for you, and then also realizing that like if you need somebody to be there for you, like 6 out of 7 days a week, then that person that you need to be there for you is going to get tired of you and everything. Where like I kind of wish I hadn't read such a in-depth and like gritty and realistic and virtuosic like exploration of that subject. As somebody who, at least in the past, has felt as at times felt that I really needed somebody to be there for me. Does that make I hope that makes sense to people, that like reading that like kind of it's always in the back of my mind now if I ever like am like talking to somebody or like need help with something like emotionally, where like am I that story comes up in my brain, where like am I being too much, am I being too demanding, where I don't know, to sum up my feelings, I guess I feel somewhat manipulated by him, both in a good way and a bad way. Like he's very good at making you feel the emotions he wants you to feel and stuff, and just some of the emotions he made me feel I'm kind of uncomfortable with in retrospect. That being said, all of that being said, at least in terms of my own writing and stuff, he is definitely an inspiration. And especially his novels, I don't necessarily regret reading. I to this day really enjoy Infinite Jest. Thinking about Infinite Jest, I would like to revisit it sometime. The Pale King is also really good. I probably like Broom of the System more than most people too. Broom of the System is kind of the most it's the most fun of his books, I would say, where he's just kind of it doesn't have the emotional like heft of his later two novels where like he's really, exploring the human condition, like plumbing the human condition, but Room of the System is kind of more just kind of fun and absurd, and it's kind of more of a romp and stuff. Yeah, I hope that made sense, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that that's fair, right? I think that if there is anybody who reads about what happened between David Foster Wallace and Mary Carr and decides that that means that they don't want to read his work, I think that's fine. If that taints that for you, then I think that that's a completely valid reason to stay away from it. I think that from my own perspective, there's a couple of things that kind of push me in a different direction than maybe you have ended up in, Luke. And one, it's that, according to his wife and according to, all reports of their marriage and what his life was like when he finally did get married and kind of settle down, so to speak, is that he had sort of learned that he had made some mistakes and that maybe he didn't have the greatest relationship or view of women in his own head, and that those things, did lead him towards growth, and those things did lead him towards being better by all accounts, right? Now, of course, that doesn't excuse what he did, but it does show that, from day one of his life to the unfortunate end of his life, he wasn't abusing and harming women the entire time and showed, zero remorse for that, right? I think, too, the other thing is that, at least from my perspective of learning about him and his work, a lot of the early stuff that I did was interviews before I actually got into Infinite Jest, his famous Charlie Rose interview, the entirety of the interview between him and the Rolling Stone writer that would eventually become the movie End of the Tour, and different interviews he did on public access radio and NPR and places like that, things that he went and did during book tour and print interviews. And in those, he comes across as a guy who's pretty scrambled and pretty, in his own head, and clearly suffers from a lot of the same stuff that he was writing about in his book, or in his books rather, plural. And so for me, going into his fiction, it felt, at least to my experience, that he was both equally trying to understand what his own problems were, as well as kind of give a broader, not diagnosis, but broader set of questions to the reader. Like he was equally trying to sort out his own depression and his own sort of complicated emotional state, as he was trying to help, potentially diagnose or prompt some reflection in his readers. And I think that that sort of combination of factors leads me to kind of be able to not necessarily look past, but understand what his writing was, not just to him, but to his readers, and how, yeah, he wasn't a great guy in the 90s. Yeah, he had some negative perspectives on women or negative relationships with women, but at least to me, that means that a lot of his writing is just as effective for him as it is for anyone coming to it. There was that process of either self-discovery or self-diagnosis or some sort of attempt to work something out. And especially given the way that his wife speaks about him and their marriage, and how his friends have always kind of maintained an image, I think that shows to me that he was somebody who realized that he had made mistakes, had some problems, and then, did what he could to grow past that. That's at least my perspective anyway. But I do definitely understand what you mean by, him pointing something out about anxiety or depression, and then having that circle back to moments in your personal life, you know, thinking maybe about doing something or saying something more than you should. That is a relatable thing that I've experienced as well.
Okay, I also think it's a valid point, and it's very important. I think that we talk about it, because otherwise it will just be the elephant in the room, and it's a really important part of the story of David Foster Wallace, and a troubling one at that. Um, for me, I think I had the same experience with reading the D.T. Max biography, and then a few later when things started to surface. Has definitely become more problematic to both read him and talk about him and all that stuff. What I find even more problematic is the question, which I don't have a good answer to, which is should we expect the writer to be as good as the literature, or should the artist be as perfect as the work? And in Norway, for instance, this has been a thing we have been debating for close to 100 years. If it's like the most probably well-known Norwegian writer is Knut Hamsun, at Hunger, like 100 years ago, and he very famously became a Nazi supporter. And Adolf Hitler died. He wrote the eulogy in the Norwegian newspapers. He's still regarded as a brilliant writer, but he was like super Nazi, which is apparently not very good. Now, so the problem with it is that, on the one hand, I do think that it's really, really possible for a writer or a movie or a filmmaker or a musician to create tremendously beautiful works of art that really says something about being alive and all that stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself are able to live up to it, to your own standards. So I'm not sure if I respect the feeling of being a little bit manipulated or lied to in a sense, but in a way I almost also want to flip it a little bit and say that there's something inherently beautiful in a flawed person being able to comfort others or something, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Mhm.
For me, I think, and this is the question I don't have an answer to. I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing that I'm able to separate these two things, meaning that when I'm reading David Foster Wallace, I'm not thinking about who he was as a person. Was he a good person or a bad person? Writing is there, and his life, for better or worse, is on the other side. There's also the factor of luck or unluck in it. I mean, this is a Pynchon podcast, and of course we know very little about Pynchon. We don't know how, what if it is suddenly was a big article tomorrow about him being a super abusive man? Would that change how we treat him, or wouldn't it? I'm just rambling on, but I really, really agree that it's problematic, and I'm happy we're talking about it. It's something I've struggled with myself, I think. That is, at the same time, I think I've come to the conclusion that I have to allow myself to take great joy, for lack of a better word, in reading him, in the same way that I'm taking great joy in watching, I don't know, Stanley Kubrick or whoever it is, regardless of if they were nice people or did how they treated other people. I regret half what I said, but I have said it.
If you want, it can probably be cut out.
But it's okay. I'll stand by it.
But so that's a good segue into the question I was going to ask Luke, actually. When it comes to David Foster Wallace, what seems to stand out in contrast to him as a comparison, or as like lumped in with other, quote unquote great white male authors of American recent history, is kind of this personal connection that so many readers have to him, and it's part of that seems to come from just the sheer amount of essay writing and sheer amount of just material he put out during his relatively short career. But a large part of it seems to be that he really was trying to write not necessarily as a way to practice progressive politics, but more generally to try and push people to examine themselves and try to push people to, particularly men, to try and overcome what we would now today happily call patriarchal indoctrination. So I guess the question that I have, Luke, is if what had come out about David Foster Wallace through your reading of his biography, if what had come out was that he was a more a less egregious example of an abuser, were he a simple adulterer, were he verbally abusive but didn't get to the point of considering murder or throwing his girlfriend out of his car, or wasn't even her car, would that have felt less like a betrayal to you, Luke?
Yes, I would say it would feel less like a betrayal. I mean, yeah, we don't need to get super into the allegations, but the allegations are, violence against, violence in a romantic relationship is just. I'll just say that I have some experience with it as the victim, to be perfectly honest, and that also kind of played into it, I think, as well. Is that I had some personal connection to this kind of stuff, where I was the victim of physical violence in a romantic relationship, and there is definitely being yelled at, being insulted is a very different feeling than being the victim of physical violence. So it would probably lessen it. I mean, lessen my feeling of manipulation and stuff. I mean, that being said, even if he was a perfect person, somehow, a sinless human being, I still think that there would be aspects of what he wrote about that I would still feel kind of manipulated by him, just in terms of, like I was saying, that one short story, and just different parts of his writing have just kind of changed the way I view things. And I haven't always been the biggest fan of how it has changed the way I've viewed things, where he's a little bit too good sometimes at manipulating his readers' emotions, if that makes sense. Where, like, I just wish I don't know, it's just he's a little bit too real at times, I guess. He captures things a little bit too sharply, a little bit too deeply, and it made, like, he made me feel too much, I guess, at times, where even if he was, like I said, a perfect person, I just kind of wish that he had, I don't know. I mean, that being said, like, that's part of the beauty of his writing, and part of why he was such and that's why people go to him. That's one of the reasons that he is still read today. So I don't know. It's just, like I said, he's just a little bit too emotionally affecting, I guess, to some of my feelings on the matter.
I just add to that because I think the story you're talking about is the one called the press person, I think, from Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, and I completely agree with that, in the sense that what that story in many ways does, and if I understand you correctly, that's sort of what you mean. It more or less takes away from you the feeling that there's anyone that can help you, because sooner or later everyone will grow tired of you. And even the story itself is constructed in a way that you get extremely tired of both the person and the narration and the story in itself. And since we're also talking about the topic of Wallace's behavior towards women, reading Brief Interviews is now, I think, the most problematic book perhaps to read. And I think if we're talking about his, I can't remember how he put it, was very well put, that he's too good at manipulating how you're supposed to feel. And I think in Brief Interviews there's quite a lot of instances where he does that. There's also this, at the end of the book, story. I can't remember the name, but a guy talking about a girl he picks up at the fair or something, and he just calls her the granola girl or something. A woman who's talks about having been a survivor of a she was almost raped and killed by this crazy guy, and the story is extremely manipulating, if we're going to use that word, in sort of directing you into what to feel at every certain point, and it keeps changing throughout the story how you're supposed to, how should I put it, understand him, the narrator, and then understand her perspective, and back and forth. And I think that book in general is sort of a showcase of his ability to both go really, really deep into the details of the psyche, but also I can understand it. It comes at a cost reading some of his stuff. But I mean, it's difficult and ending, but some of it I can definitely understand that it's dangerous in a way that it forces you to revisit stuff or think about stuff that perhaps is a little more deeper than you were supposed to be thinking about stuff.
Yeah, I just spent a lot of time nodding along, so I definitely agree.
What might be surprising is, or might not, who knows, is that is maybe the most enticing thing I've ever heard anyone say about David Foster Wallace, that he is too effective as an emotional manipulator, and therefore is perhaps dangerous, but in general off-putting in that way. And that's a very interesting idea for an author, from people who have read widely of his work.
Yeah, and I mean, there's something kind of, like manipulative people, like, my best friend in college, I would call him, I'm still friends with him, I would call him manipulative. But he's also a very charismatic, likable person, who generally gets his way. You know what I'm saying? Like there is manipulative, it can be like, and I feel like that friend has manipulated me in both good and bad ways. And I also feel like David Foster Wallace has kind of manipulated me in both good and bad ways, where he made me kind of examine the human condition in a way that in a deeper way, but also in a way that I'm kind of uncomfortable with sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, like the core of the very thing that we're in, that y'all are sort of criticizing him for, is kind of the core of why writing has always been framed as dangerous, right? And rhetoric in general has always been framed as dangerous, right? So is it fair to criticize an author for being too good of a witch doctor? Does that make sense?
I think it is fair, but I think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would necessarily want to put down a specific it is fair or isn't fair. And I think it more comes down to the individual experience you have reading. You know, if like I am sure there are some people who would read the section of Infinite Jest about like video calling and get super stressed out about whether or not they're paying an adequate amount of attention to somebody over the phone afterwards, because he describes all of these different sort of revelations that people had when suddenly phone calls were made with a visual component rather than just an audio one. And if you read that section and it does like fill you with stress and anxiety, then that is a bad thing for you. But if it's a case where you can read it and then walk away from it feeling like you maybe have learned something, or that it's just sort of pointed out something interesting as a facet of sort of the human experience or human behavior, and move on, then it is just merely that. I don't know if I would necessarily put any of that at the author, and more so based on what you get out of it, or what the writing does to you, right? Like there are books that I have read that have made me very, very emotional that I don't really return to for that purpose. They were really great, but I also know that I would like lose composure if I go back to them again. But I think that maybe isn't the same perspective that everyone's going to have.
It's also a question whether or not the reward is worth the risk in a sense. But you have to make a choice because if you go into it, you have to let's go all the way. But there is also another aspect with this, which is I think his ability to show life that is very unfamiliar to you. For instance, I can't really say that I have very much experience with drug use and overuse of alcohol, etc. But I think that prior to reading Infinite Jest, I had always this feeling of when you're coming across like really hardcore alcoholics or drug addicts that I couldn't really understand how they ended up there, or I couldn't really connect to them in a way. But reading some of the AA stuff, Infinite Jest, and I'm not talking about necessarily the most horrible stories like the one with someone walking around with a dead infant and etc. But in general, that whole trying to survive day to day that he talks about, really for the first time, I think, giving a face to people in AA and how they are, in some sense, heroes in the same way that people at the IRS are in he really makes you understand those people and see them as human being in a way that at least completely forever changed my view on addiction and addicted people and how you should treat them and how you should try to connect and really see yourself in them. And that I'm really thankful for. So I even though I can relate to some of the stuff that sticks with you for the, I wouldn't necessarily say the wrong reasons, but it sticks with you in a problematic way, like the first person. There's also this stuff that sticks with you probably for the rest of your life, and it changes the way you see the world, or less.
Then that leads me to kind of a question that kind of pulling all these threads together. So the fact is that he did things which made many people. It's not just you, Luke. We're kind of accidentally centering you as the person who feels torn, but it's a widely held feeling. But the fact is that his abusive behavior in relationship is not the only betrayal. I mean, the things that all of you have said so much, or sorry, have said so far the things which all of you have said so far in this conversation, which were so moving about David Foster Wallace's work, were, his calls for perseverance, his calls for, sincerity, and to finding ways to get along and finding ways to relate to other people. And how does that reconcile with him killing himself? Is that the real issue? Is it that he had these incredible technical skills, and yet his mind worked in such a way that he could not quite, or work in the right way to survive in society, and that is therefore why he might be somewhat dangerous to read for certain people going through or dealing with certain issues? Was there some, per se, lack of compassion for himself, or lack of understanding of certain aspects of humanity that are really to blame, rather than his ability to write precisely and persuasively about emotion?
But isn't it maybe as simple as it's usually much easier to help other people than yourself? I think perhaps there could be something to that, like changing something radical in your own life is often more difficult than helping someone else, and you can really go out of your way to help someone else cope with something or getting through something, because there's an reward in it. Not that that's why you do it, but it's rewarding to feel like a good person when you're helping others, but you don't necessarily get that feeling like you're a good person when you're helping yourself. Strange enough, at least that's my experience. So I think for me, there's no what's the word? Can't remember the word. It's getting close to midnight in Norway. Again, you can really help someone. I completely lost my track of thought. Just looking for the word.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Will, and I think that Johan is certainly correct in that there is something, for better or worse, that feels more rewarding about helping other people than it does if you're helping yourself. Helping yourself, I think a lot of people maybe have a mindset that's just sort of like status quo. It's what you're supposed to do. So there's not as much of a response to it as when you really like assist someone in your personal life. And I think that, like I had mentioned before, I think that a good chunk of David Foster Wallace's writing wasn't explicitly just to help other people. It was also him trying to understand his own neuroses and his own, troubles and his own depression and his own anxiety. I mean, there's plenty of stuff in his work about hyperhidrosis and over sweating, which he had in his personal life, to point to the idea that he was not writing just for his readers. He was also writing for himself. And I think that if you look into, as I kind of talked about in the Pale King bonus episode, the circumstances in his professional life and in his personal life surrounding the time that he unfortunately committed suicide. I don't want to say the picture becomes pretty clear, but it does bring up a fair number of questions that might help you understand why that happened, right? Like, going off of an antidepressant that you've been on since you were in your early 20s as a 40-year-old is going to be really tough. And getting so anxious about finding a replacement with no side effects that you just cease taking antidepressants for the first time since you were in your early 20s is also pretty tough. And then when the avenue by which you have done a lot of growth, presumably, that being your writing, is getting more difficult, and the novel you're working on isn't coming to fruition in the way that you're expecting it to, mixed with all of those other things, adds another layer of difficulty. And I'm not trying to say that this is why he chose to do what he did, but I think it can point to just that for him, for whatever reason, the old methods that he had to either cope or to move forward just didn't work for him anymore. And why that is, right? No one will ever know. It is one of the great kind of questions, I would say, when it comes to his work, in the sense that, like you had mentioned, a guy who wrote so much for so long about mental health and about happiness and about perseverance and all of that ends up dying the way that he did, especially at a time where, you could sort of assume that he should have been at his happiest. He was married, by all accounts, happily married, had a couple of dogs, had a house in California, had a lot of, high degree of recognition for his work. He was teaching in a university, all of that. You would assume that wouldn't be the time that you would do that. But I think that what it really does, at least for me anyway, is underscores the fact that mental illness, the struggles of like living as an adult in the world, suicidal ideation, anxiety, whatever specific phrase you would want to use, they're all very difficult. They're all very complicated, and there's not going to be a one size fits all solution, even to a guy who maybe gives a lot of people a solution. And that these things can change, and that perseverance, that concept of no one moment is unendurable, is still a good thing to believe in, and still a good thing to kind of continue to strive after, even if the person who told you about it maybe ended up not being able to do that. There's not to put a overly grandiose sense to his work, but there is an idea of, you can continue to bear the torch, right? Even if the originator of it is passed. And that's at least where I see that coming into play, right? Like his work was obviously a way for him to explore those aspects of himself and to try and, heal some of those aspects of himself. And so while it may not have worked for him in the end, at least not on a permanent basis, it can still work for other people or at least support them some way.
I completely agree to that, and it also made me think of one of the things we talked about early in the episode when I referred to the character Kate Gumpert in Infinite Jest and how she has this feeling and she's severely depressed that it will never go away, and her doctor reminds her that this tends to go away. You have these periods and then it gets better. And I think, without knowing, of course, that at the end when Wallace was trying to get back on his original antidepressant and they didn't have the same effect, it's not very likely to think that had that feeling of, okay, this time it's real, this time it's not going to go over, and having that feeling of seeing things clearly for the first time. And I think he writes about that in somewhere as well. That completely changes everything. Then it doesn't matter what stuff you've written, because that's stuff like whatever you wrote about perseverance or coping mechanisms, etc., doesn't mean anything to you anymore, because now you finally see the world for what it really is, etc., and it just completely changes the game. And unless you have medication or professional help or probably a lot of luck, then you're helpless against it, I think. So I don't really feel that what he's written about depression or these things are dangerous in that sense or manipulative or anything. I think he was just very, very unlucky that he stopped taking his antidepressants because he felt that, okay, this is perhaps the time to do it. And now we know a lot more about antidepressants and how you have this, I don't know the English words for it, it's called seponering in Norwegian, how it stays in the body and then can really make the symptoms much, much, much worse when you go off it. And how when you start taking the same brand again, it won't have the same effect. So I still think that it was mentioned that there's good advice in a lot of these texts that we can use. You can carry the torch, I think was mentioned. I think the only specific story of Wallace that I find I'm hesitant to use the word dangerous because I am a very strong opponent to thinking that any kind of literature is dangerous or that it shouldn't be read or anything. I'm thinking about the story in Oblivion, which is perhaps the best story in there, which is called Good Old Neon, which ends with a suicide, and probably not a good idea to read if you're contemplating it. Other than that, I think there's I even though I really don't know anything about it, I have a great respect or understanding, I think, that at the end he wasn't able to listen to his own reassurances that things were going to be okay again. And finally, on an end note on that subject, and again, this can't compare at all, but I can only imagine trying in what is this, like 2006, 2007, and 2008, trying your hardest to figure a way out to write this next novel, which is going to top Infinite Jest, which by then you know that hundreds of thousands of people all around the world think is the greatest thing since Red Game Sliced, etc. And then not being able to figure it out And as you read through the different biographies and all these great articles written by people who has researched at the Harry Ransom Center, etc., and seeing all these different versions of the Pale King, starting from when it was called Sir John Feelgood and was sort of a porno novel, and then it was this Peoria 4 and all these different versions, and he couldn't for the life of him find a way to write that novel. And the irony, of course, is that the version we were left with, the one that Michael Peach put together, the irony is that it's I think it's a pretty perfect novel, even unfinished. But at that time, it was impossible for him to see it. And again, even though I don't have any experience with depression, I have more experience than I would like to have with being stuck in a big writing project and suddenly having that feeling that you wasted years of your life and friendship and work and everything with writing this piece of shit that's not going to work, and you should just, jump off a building because you will never write anything good again. And I can only imagine if you're having that feeling at the same time you're struggling with mental illness. It's a pretty tough odds.
Yeah, couldn't add anything else to that. I agree 100%, Johan. You have another question, Will?
Also, okay. One of the questions I have written down here, because I was, sitting down, preparing for the show, wasn't quite expecting it to be, um, so, so, um, what is the word I'm looking for? Sorrowful, I suppose. Um, and so I wrote the question as flippantly as, was David Foster Wallace a saint or a demon?
Mm,
But it does sound like we've already answered that question. Basically, no, he was just a person.
yeah.
Period. Um, but I guess that does. Let's move more towards his work then, unless anyone has. Not his work. I guess we've been talking about work, but let's talk about more specifically like Infinite Jest, because that is what most people know him for. That is what most people think about as like describing his work. It's his magnum opus, capital letters.
Mhm.
So is it as good as everyone says it is? I mean, I know your answer, Kate. Um, but people talk about it in the same way that a lot of people talk about books like The Brothers Karamazov or Moby Dick, or um, like Mrs. Dalloway, like these books that some people talk about reading, picking up in a certain moment of their lives, and it changes everything for them, and they keep going back to it, and they can find more depth to plumb constantly. Uh, we- we've heard the answer from you, Kate. What about Johan, Luke? Does it hold up, or did it hold up for you in that same way as a work in its own right?
If I can go first and say yes, absolutely. I definitely think it does. I would go even further. I think actually much better than it gets credited for. Again, because most people have heard of the book and most people have not read it. And you have this idea of what it is, and maybe if you read a short piece of it here or there, you might get the feeling that okay, it's a sad book, or it's a funny one, or it has this coolness, because it definitely has a kind of coolness in the language. It's written by a much younger guy than El King, for instance. But I think the inventiveness in language, scope, ability to see different kinds of people, and just the playfulness and the labyrinthine way it's written, it can really, I think, hold its own against those books you mentioned. And I also mentioned James Joyce because I feel that if we take away all the hipster stuff and all the other things that is it understandable that if you're reading Infinite Jest on the subway, you might want to have it in a brown paper bag. That's a little bit hinted. I still think it's a brilliant, brilliant novel that we might not see the likes of until for decades.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if Gravity's Rainbow, like 2666 novels like that, or like 100 on the scale of 0 to 100, I would say Infinite Jest is somewhere between like a 95 to a 98, where I don't think it's quite as good as some of the books it's compared to, some of the books that influenced it, and that it influenced, or some of the books that are in the same kind of conversation for really big books that are ambitious masterpieces. That being said, I do think that if you go in, I mean, if you go into it expecting it to be better than Moby Dick, and I haven't actually read Moby Dick, but if you go into it expecting it to be better than Gravity's Rainbow, better than all these other novels, I think you might be disappointed. But if you go into it expecting, one of, if not the best books of the '90s, then yeah, I think your expectations will be met. I think it's probably, of novels I've read from the 20th century, it's definitely top 10, maybe even top 5. I don't think it's the best that of all the up from that time period, but I do think it's definitely up there. I like the Pale King a lot too, but this is off topic for the question, I guess. But I in some ways think that the Pale King is in some ways superior to Infinite Jest in that it's a little bit more, which is this kind of weird to say about an unfinished posthumous novel, but in some ways it's kind of a little bit more focused. And it's a little bit kind of there's a greater depth of clarity to the Pale King. Where as much as I love Infinite Jest and enjoyed reading it a lot, I don't even think it's his best novel or his best book. I think Pale King is probably better.
And just add it because I'm so glad you mentioned that, because this is a thing I've been struggling with for many, many years, trying to figure out which one I think is better, Pale King or Infinite Jest. And I also think that, this changes on a weekly basis, but in many ways, I think that King as it is a superior novel to Infinite Jest. You can only imagine what it could have been if it was finished. At the same time, you could also imagine that it would have been a lesser book if it was finished, because maybe that would have been a bloated novel or went off in all these different directions. But I agree with how it's a very different novel, and that's another thing. How Pale King and Infinite Jest are. If you look at it, they're really extremely different, I think, from each other, even though they're written in the same, from a technical standpoint, written much in the same way, that in the sense that we go from all these different characters and there's all these connections and all these stories, and sometimes you're in a chapter for 100 plus pages and there's all these asides and the goodbye questions, etc., etc., etc. But I'm not really sure that Infinite Jest is even the best Foster Wallace book. I would also even say that Oblivion is pretty darn good. But I do feel that if you've read Moby Dick and you're moving on to Infinite Jest, you won't be disappointed. Just be happy to be on land. And
I was literally going to ask you anything that you felt they didn't say, or anything you haven't said in the past that you've wanted to say.
Yeah, well, I do think both of them are correct in that. I think The Pale King is a better novel, and I think it's a better novel because it takes all of this stuff that David Foster Wallace does incredibly well in Infinite Jest and just stays focused on those really excellent elements, and nothing in the version of Pale King that we got can really be cut from it. Some of it you can speculate where it would have headed, or what IRS agent at the Peoria Processing Center matches up to what kind of backstory segment, or the different story threads. But none of it can really be cut necessarily. I know David Foster Wallace would disagree, but there are parts of Infinite Jest that don't need to be there, right? Like it is certainly doing a meta commentary where the entertainment is called Infinite Jest in the world of the book, and the book is also called Infinite Jest, in both the entertainment and the novel are structured in a circle, and you can spend the rest of your life breaking it apart and all of that. I totally understand all of that, right? And I understand why that informs David Foster Wallace's belief when he was writing it, that nothing should be cut out of it. But that doesn't mean that every single scene and sentence on the page in that book is necessary to make that point, or to make the rest of the points of the book, right? I think that the book itself, to answer another portion of your question, does hold up incredibly well, though. And I think it probably holds up better now than maybe it even did in the 90s when it was published, because there's a description of it in the Cambridge Companion to David Foster Wallace, where it basically says that, we are now living in the world that David Foster Wallace envisioned. And I think that's absolutely true. I think that sort of Infinite Jest describes a world that felt far off in 1994, but has ended up being the one that we live in. Maybe there are specific things that are a little bit different. We don't have subsidized time. We don't have, the Statue of Liberty holding different objects based upon what year of subsidized time you're in. We no longer use cartridges for, movies and things like that. But from a perspective of what technology advanced into and what effect that had on the average person, which I think is the most resonant stuff in that book, to a reader coming to it in 2025. I think all of that is still relevant and has yet to have been equaled by another writer, even with all of these other writers, these newer writers, having the benefit of growing up in that world, or getting a chance to see what that world is. Maybe they're more accurate in their predictions of what technology looks like, but from a perspective of actually explaining the effect of the modern world on the individual person, or envisioning what the effect of the modern world on an individual person can be, where it is so easy to borrow the man's words himself, sit in a room with images on a screen made by people who do not love us but want our money. I think that has yet to be paralleled or even come close to by any author that comes to mind.
I think definitely it's worth to mention that part of the reason I think Infinite Jest is such a great book is also that it's with all good of art. It's a little bit flawed, and I think you read what we have of the Pale King, and even though Peach edited it, I think it's fairly easy to see that ability of us to self-edit greatly improved over the years, which I can only speak from my own experiences, that that's something that does happen after having been a writer for 20 years or something. It gets easier to accept other people's ideas, and it gets easier to cut stuff, and you become a little less self-indulgent, hopefully, or at least the ability to take advice from editors improves somewhat. And again, I think one of the reasons I really love Infinite Jest is now and then, here and there are these pages or paragraphs, or even sometimes a few chapters that I would probably have cut if I could. There is a funny story regarding that. Maybe you know it, but apparently one of the first pieces of writing for Infinite Jest was done in the late 80s, I think, and ended up in a book. And it comes fairly early in the novel. It's 2 or 3 pages, I think, written a very oral sense to sound like an African American person. It starts with what is it called? First line is something like "Wardine say her mama and treat her right," and it goes on and on and on. And later years, it has been much looked upon as something that it's a little bit toward. When you take cultural appropriation, is that the word? When you take someone else's experience and language and try to make it your own. And apparently, this was a couple of pages that Peach and probably and his agent, I think as well, tried to persuade him to cut, and he wouldn't for the life of him cut it. And there are probably a few other things like that in the book that could have benefited for a little Jim. That is again the beauty, I think, of Infinite Jest. It's everything but a kitchen sink in there, and most of it makes sense, and most of it connects in ways that he either anticipated or did not anticipate. Because as with all books, this one is smarter than the writer itself, and I think that is one of the reasons I really hold Infinite Jest in such high regard. That takes a couple of wrong turns. Perhaps the wheelchair assassin chapters with the Movat and Steepley are a little bit too Lynch-esque, but still, as a whole, I can't really see any other way he could have done it.
Okay, so then I guess I'm gonna I phrased this question specifically about Infinite Jest, but if you have obviously most of you have personal favorites that are not Infinite Jest, but and any think about your. I'm gonna ask all of you sit and think about your ideal form of David Foster Wallace's fiction writing, because I think his essays are widely respected enough that they don't need to be in this. But in terms of his fiction, what kind of person needs his fiction?
That's a good question. I would say, I mean, first, the kind of people that need his fiction the most are probably, at least to me, are kind of online edgelords. Like David Foster Wallace is kind of popular on 4chan, on the lit board. That being said, there's like places like that on the internet are kind of the opposite of a lot of like the opposite of they espouse the kind of stuff that's kind of the opposite of what David Foster Wallace was trying to point out, what David Foster Wallace was trying to get people to be, and what David Foster Wallace was trying to communicate. Maybe that's just because I'm not around a lot of people that are I don't surround myself with people that are not that struggle with empathy and stuff. But yeah, I mean that question immediately made me think of the people on 4chan who use call other people bad names and everything just because they disagree with their opinion and stuff like that. And that happens on Reddit and other places as well. But it's generally like David Foster Wallace's kind of whole thing with like meeting people where they are. Even like kind of some of the stuff that Johan was talking about earlier with understanding addiction and understanding, like a lot of people don't understand that addiction is 8 or 9 times out of 10 like deeply related to trauma and to escaping trauma, and stuff like that. Just kind of understanding that there's often a reason why people feel the way they do, or there's often a reason why people are the way they are. And people that hang out on places like 4chan and get on there just to troll people and insult people, are probably, to me at least, people that need to read something like This Is Water or Wallace's fiction.
That's a good question, especially with the use of the word need. I was actually talking about this with my partner because she is actively reading it as we speak. She's I think like 300-ish pages into the book. And I took the same exact like conversational tactic with her as I do with everybody. Where like they ask what my favorite book is, I tell them, and then I say, but like it's not for everybody. I'm not necessarily recommending anybody read it, but like if you do read it, it's quite an impressive um, experience and quite an impressive piece of fiction. Because I do acknowledge that like it is incredibly difficult. If I'm looking specifically at that word need though, I would say that like most people now in the modern world probably need it in the sense that we live in a world that's pretty disconnected. We are never more connected in a superficial way in human history than we are currently. But there is not a lot of genuine connection in the sense of empathy and earnestness and a real groundedness in both yourself and your understanding of your self identity, and then also the people around you. Kind of like what Will is saying. I think that, or I'm sorry, that Luke is saying rather. And I think that his example of like 4chan and these people online, that is certainly, I would say, the most sort of um, hyper version of this, right? But I think that there is some of that same judgmental malaise that exists within most people on the planet. And I think that Infinite Jest, or certainly This Is Water, what I often tell people is like, Infinite Jest isn't for everybody, and if you don't read it, that's okay. But like, This Is Water is very accessible, and he gets a lot of the same points across. So you could certainly start there. So I would say that there is probably a need for writing of this kind by most people who maybe aren't as connected to themselves and to an empathetic viewpoint of others as they could be. But that also feels kind of like a cop out answer to me. But yeah, I would say that the world that we live in is kind of the one that he was scared of. And so a lot of the stuff that he wrote about, I would say, is really relevant to most of the people alive today.
I think you gave enough detail that it's not a cop out.
I also I agree on that, and I would also say that I think This Is Water is something that could be read or actually listened to by anyone who does their own grocery shopping. And for the others, like I sometimes think about like a CEO of a big company or someone, or some of these people I tend to meet that are men in their 50s or 60s, sometimes 30s, and they seem to be proud not to read literary fiction. If they read, they do read like memoirs or biographies or stuff like that. Sort of the feeling that they almost loathe fiction and consider it something that wives are reading to, just to get their emotional fix or read something romantic or something. I would really love to have seen one of these big rich CEOs really taking the time to read one of these books, just to see what literature is able to do. Not necessarily to like it, but to be forced to the perspective of someone else and see that this is actually real work that goes into it. It is not something you can just sit and romanticize and go together last minute. This is a result of hard thinking and work. And then there's this specific person I've been thinking about this for close to 15 years now, which is my own accountant. I don't think he's a person who reads. I've never asked him, but I've been thinking about this for so many years. I mean, this is what he does. He does the work of the Pale King, even though not for the Norwegian version of IRS, but he does taxes for people. And even though I haven't spoken to him about it, I have this feeling that at some level he must think that I've wasted my life or something just doing other people's taxes and sitting here with these mundane forms and filling them out. And I would have loved to at least have him read that section of the Pale King where the is it the temp or something has this summation about how they are called to account and how there's a form of heroism to be able to survive extreme boredom, and how there's some of brilliance involved in it. That is one of the reasons I think I really love King, because it really builds on the fact that you don't have to be the world's most popular and have a gazillion amount of followers on Instagram or whatever to something really, really good. I would love to have given him the book, but at the same time, I'm afraid that he will be self-conscious and think that I think that he has a boring job.
Well, on one hand, I do think most accountants are aware that it is boring work.
Yeah, but are they aware of the fact that it's also heroic? That's the question.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So then, is there anyone who absolutely should not read X work from David Foster Wallace, or do you think there are certain people who don't need it? Maybe someone bought a copy 20 years ago, put it on their shelf, and every once in a while thinks I should read this, but then they think about buying another bookmark and it frustrates them, so they just don't. Anyone you want to relieve that stress for, or do you think do you all just think that most people should read Infinite Jest or Pale King or whatever?
Well, we have to mention this the fact that both the Pale King and Infinite Jest are also on some level hard books. It's not just a long book, but it's a pretty hard book if you're not used to reading literature. I mean, you guys are really into fiction, and which is really, really hard reading. And I think if you're a casual reader, or if you're someone who doesn't read at all, this goes a little bit against what I was just saying, but nonetheless, if you're just a casual reader thinking you should read more, it's not necessarily it's not a given that starting to plow through Infinite Jest will make you a happy little person, because it demands concentration. You have to put in the work, and at the same time, if you're trying to get a 16 or 18-year-old person to get interested in literature, it's not necessarily a good thing to throw the Pale King at them and say this will change your life. It could also end up you hating literature, because it takes time to learn to read, I think, literature of this quality, whether we like it or not. Yeah. So, which again, I think is why most Wallace readers seem to have started with the essays, because that's an entry point to which is it's fairly easy to get into.
Yeah, I would agree completely what you had said, Johan. I think I have really only made like a strong recommendation of like you should read this to two people, one of which is my current partner, who loves to read, and we were in a book club together before we were dating, and then the other is another member of that book club, and then the third person I recommended it to was the first person I recommended it to, chronologically, like after I had finished reading it, and her response to like my emphatic like you have to read this was forcing herself to read 50 pages a day, so she finished reading it in like a very short number of weeks, and then also skipping the endnotes, right? So Like exactly what Johan is saying. If you're a person who is not an active reader, like not reading a ton in general, or is less used to like bigger, longer, more difficult books, then yeah, you're probably not going to experience it the way that it's meant to be experienced. And I don't just mean that from a perspective of you're meant to get a ton out of Infinite Jest and you're meant to become a happier person afterwards, but from the perspective of what David Foster Wallace is trying to create as an experience. He's mentioned in interviews many times that part of the reason why it's so long and it's so dense and fractured is because it's a way to force the reader to pay attention. So that's why after that first person responded to my recommendation in that way, and then I kind of checked myself and thought, yeah, this isn't really a book for everybody, and that's okay. Um, I would agree that if you're someone who who doesn't read a ton or doesn't read longer, more demanding books from an attention and a thought perspective, then yeah, they can probably hand the book off to somebody else or wait until they get to that point in their kind of like reader life if they get there. And if they never do, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with reading like short genre fiction novels as the entirety of the experience of what you read in life. Yeah, so it's a case where because of the way that it's written and structured, it kind of needs to be given to a certain kind of reader, or to really be experienced the way that it's meant to be, you kind of have to be a certain type of reader. And if you're not that type of reader, then you can probably skip it, and that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, so my answer is kind of twofold. I was actually thinking about adding to the people who need to read Infinite Jest, people who need to read David Foster Wallace. I have seen, I forget what sci-fi writer said this, but I have seen at least one sci-fi writer talk about how a lot of, especially novice sci-fi writers, only read sci-fi. So, I think a lot of, because Infinite Jest, especially, it pretty much is sci-fi. I mean, it's set in the future. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of world building stuff. I mean, it is sci-fi in a lot of ways. It's classified as literary fiction, but it really is sci-fi too. And I do think that there's a lot of sci-fi writers that could gain a lot by reading David Foster Wallace, I think. Um, that being said, I do think that there's a type of writer who should not read David Foster Wallace. Just somebody like it brings to mind somebody like the fictional author and Johan's The Red Handler, where I could see that fictional writer reading Wallace and saying, well, David Foster Wallace got away with writing 1,200 pages with a bunch of endnotes. You know what I'm saying? Where like there's a kind
That's a
of
great call out. Yeah.
yeah, there's a type of writer that is maybe not published very much or has never been published, but is very ambitious and thinks more of themselves than they should. That maybe David Foster Wallace is just not going to be a good role model for, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And also to I think if you're really starting out as a writer, it could go both ways. I'm now really happy that I didn't really started to read him until I had published books for 10 years. I think that changed a lot for me. Maybe afraid to write anything after.
Okay. Well, that is an interesting angle. The that it might be either intimidating or overly compelling as a model.
Yeah. Well, I think Pinchon, to link it back to the normal topic of this podcast, is the same. I would say is the same situation. That there is certainly a certain type of writer or younger author that can think that because Pinchon can get away with it, or because Pinchon writes this way, that they also can. That's a great point you made, Luke.
Yeah, I think personally, after reading Gravity's Rainbow, I couldn't get myself to write for like maybe close to a year. To your point, but so then I guess that one of the things that, especially in places like 4chan's lit, or is often said derisively about all of Wallace's fiction is that he's just he has predigested DeLillo and Joyce and Pynchon and or Gaddis and or whoever you want to throw into that postmodern milieu. Bridge that back to the previous question I asked. So unanimously, you would all agree that he did not do that. That his work does expand upon the themes that he draws influence from those previous authors.
Most definitely. I mean, all writers are influenced by other writers, and this is how literature moves forward. But I think that nothing in Wallace that feels like a derivative of these other writers. It's of course interesting that in all these interviews he seems to downplay Pynchon as an influence and talking about him as a mostly 60s and 70s writer. Well, it's very clear, I think, that Pynchon was a great influence on him, and also the reason why he and a lot of us came from Wallace to Pynchon. But no, I definitely don't think that he's like a lesser copy of them. It more has to do with not really understanding how art is.
Yeah, I would say people who are making that argument earnestly probably fail to understand what Wallace was attempting to do thematically. And it's interesting because you can see the progression from to use a word that is broadly unhelpful but is for this discussion, postmodernism to what he ended up writing later on in his life, which some people call it postmodernism, some people call it new sincerity. At no point did Wallace have any specific word for it or define himself as part of it. In that, the stuff that he was writing in college, he would describe as very avant-garde, very postmodern, very experimental stuff. And then you arrive at The Broom of the System, which was his thesis for his MFA in creative writing. And that is the closest thing you can possibly get to Wallace's Pynchon influences. And then at some point, he developed some ideas about postmodernism's usefulness to society or literature or critique. That to discuss those would send me off on a tangent that would last a very long time, to eventually leading him towards this pivot in a direction where he still took a lot of the experimental concepts of those influences that you mentioned, but put very, very simply, he thought that a lot of that writing ended up leading the world in a more derisive place, a more cynical, sarcastic place. And that sort of the antidote to that was a return to sincerity, earnestness, honesty, things like that. And so he absorbed a lot of the technical aspects of those influences. But I do believe that as he matured into the writer that he is known for being, he used those influences underneath sort of the milieu of a different culture and a different intent that makes his work important enough on its own to read. And you mentioned Zadie Smith at the beginning of the episode. I would say that she is maybe the closest equivalent to him in the modern publishing landscape, not from a technical perspective, but from what she is trying to do from a thematic perspective, and the high degree of empathy and earnestness that she talks about a lot in interviews, but then also suffuses into her novels.
Yeah, I do think that Pynchon's influence on Wallace was perhaps overstated. I haven't read any Gaddis, so I can't really speak to whether or not Gaddis was a big influence. I do know that I think around the time Infinite Jest was published, the David Foster Wallace, I think he said in an interview that, or maybe Franzen or somebody said in an interview that people were so focused on Pynchon's supposed influence on David Foster Wallace that they were kind of underplaying or underselling how much DeLillo influenced him, which I do think is true. Where I do think that if anything, DeLillo may have influenced Pynchon even more than, or influenced Wallace even more than Pynchon did. That's kind of that was my little thesis in undergrad. For my undergrad thesis was that was taking that quote about the Pynchon influence being overstated and the DeLillo influence being understated, and kind of building it into the whole thesis of Wallace kind of playing with a lot of the same stuff that DeLillo plays with in End Zone specifically.
I think you're correct, Luke. I would agree.
Yeah. I like Wallace is obviously influenced by Pynchon, but I don't think it's quite as, I don't think that influences, I think that influence is overstated, like I said. And yeah, I do think that Wallace he does his own thing in some ways. I think he's more original than people give him credit for, where he's not like directly like aping or cribbing from other people. There's stuff that this is true of pretty much any published author of any worth or note, that they're going to have their own spin on things. But I do think that Wallace did at least somewhat blaze his own trail, and as Kate pointed out, as his career progressed, became more and more his own man.
Absolutely. I think one question I wanted to ask you, which I've been thinking about, a year after Infinite Jest came out, then Don DeLillo publishes Underworld, and then while Wallace is probably struggling a lot with the Pale King material, and Pynchon just slams down against the day. Regardless of how much influence he had or didn't have on him, Pynchon was probably have been a very important writer for Wallace, just as one of the big American writers. Do you think he was intimidated by the publishing of Against the Day? Do you think he thought about it at all?
It'd be interesting to see if Wallace ever commented on anything related to Against the Day in interviews. I don't know if he gave many interviews in the last couple years of his life. I do think that could play a part of it, where the Pale King was a very ambitious novel with a lot of moving parts, a lot of different characters, and perhaps, at least in manuscript form, like less of a through line than Against the Day. And I do think that Wallace was kind of continually trying to outdo his predecessors. Where I know that I feel like I've heard that Pynchon was, like, in manuscript form, like Gravity's. One of the reasons that Gravity's Rainbow is as long as it is because Pynchon wanted it to be longer than Ulysses. And I do think that Wallace may have been like trying to kind of outdo his predecessors in some ways, and kind of been intimidated by his own ambition with the Pale King.
Yeah, I think there's a case to be made that you're right about that. In a letter to his editor when he was writing the Pale King, he had mentioned that probably the ideal way for him to write the novel, but that would be impossible to sell it or even for Michael Peach to edit it, would be for him to write 5,000 manuscript pages, and then to have Michael Peach just sort of cut it down to what is completely necessary. A process that, even if feasible, he acknowledges in the letter would probably drive him insane, seeing that much of his own material cut out.
I was just saying that I think Peach says something like he politely declines the offer to read 5,000 pages, I think.
Yeah. He does. And thinking about what Against the Day represents, as somebody who's only read a chunk of it, hasn't even read the entirety of it, that novel is kaleidoscopic and comprehensive in its description of the engines by which both capitalism in its modern understanding and the world in its just pre-modern understanding were sort of spun up. That I think if you're a writer operating at the top of your game, and certainly are sort of someone who is at one point in your life or another been influenced by the writer who publishes that book, that there wouldn't be some pressure on you to see if you couldn't do the same thing. Um, and it seems like maybe there was a version of the Pale King where Wallace maybe was thinking about whether or not he could do something similar to that. Obviously, with a different subject matter, um, and in a much different format, but maybe certainly as comprehensive. I mean, tackling the concept of making peace with adult life and work is a big enough uh, theme in itself for you to write an untold number of pages.
Yeah, I think I might have accidentally proposed a thesis idea for someone in Wallace studies. Um, the Raymond Chandler influence
Hmm.
on Wallace. Anyway, that brings me to y'all have more or less pretty clearly stated that anyone who isn't serious about reading fiction um, doesn't need to push themselves to read Infinite Jest or The Pale King just to say they've done it. But for people who say people who have read, broadly, it would you say there are particular authors or books or genres that would benefit someone going into Wallace's work to get at what you all find so beneficial about his writing? Does that, that phrase that horribly? Does that make any sense?
Sure. What authors as well as in conversation with that might help his points come across more clear to a first time reader?
Sure. Yeah. Authors or genres work that would do so. Yeah.
That's a great question. This might seem like a weird initial answer, but I actually say Robert Caro. I understand that he is a journalist as opposed to a fiction writer, but the way in which he exhaustively researches and then also has um, an extreme amount of empathy for his subject um, is probably a person that I would recommend someone read. Um, I mean, he spends 1,000 pages tearing apart Robert Moses in the Power Broker, but that is not without a balance to it of providing a lot of empathy to understanding Robert Caro as a person, or I'm sorry, Robert Moses as a person, and then also kind of the inherent tragedy of what his own ambition did to himself over the course of his career. Of course, that's also a tough recommendation on its own, but he would be someone that I would say would really emphasize like the empathy angle and the research angle that Wallace would also have in his work. Um, man, this is because it's tough without just saying like his nonfiction. Um, I think Don DeLillo is a great one as well. For all of the reasons that Luke has kind of mentioned. Um, I don't think Pynchon is required reading to understand Wallace. I would say Zadie Smith um, would be a good stepping stone towards Wallace as well, for the same reasons of empathy and kind of. Um, Zadie Smith has described herself, and I think her fiction is accurately described as being somewhat voyeuristic, in the sense that a lot of the people that she chooses to write about don't necessarily look like her or come from the same place that she comes from. And so it sort of requires this kind of outside observer or viewer effect from both herself and then consequently her reader to put themselves in the position of who they are um, reading about, which I think is probably helpful towards building towards sort of a Wallace sort of thing. And then I would maybe actually also say like Richard Powers. Um, I think that there are some elements in Richard Powers' work that would maybe find some harmony within David Foster Wallace's work, um, from its interest in people and from its interest in people's motivations and how kind of certain for individuals can unfold um, towards sort of their ultimate destiny, or sort of a pivotal turning point in their life. Those would be the first ones that I would say I would point to.
Any others come to mind, guys?
I would say some of the stuff that's already been talked about in terms of extrapolating the present into the future that David Foster Wallace does, it kind of reminded me of William Gibson in some ways, where William Gibson is kind of ultra concise and kind of the anti David Foster Wallace in some ways, where he's not, he doesn't really. I don't think William Gibson really explores empathy at all, and while William Gibson does explore the human condition some, it's not necessarily his main focus, but the world building and kind of the focus on the internet and the implications of the internet and stuff, I do think that they're in conversation with one another, at least somewhat. I really have no idea if William Gibson ever read any David Foster Wallace, but I do think that David Foster Wallace, if he didn't read Neuromancer, was definitely aware of Neuromancer. And I would say the chances of David Foster Wallace having read Neuromancer are higher than 50%. Let me think. There was another person I was thinking of. Oh, another sci-fi writer that I could see being kind of similar to David Foster Wallace, at least in some ways, is Kim Stanley Robinson. Just for a lot of the same reasons for William Gibson, just extrapolating the present into the future in a way that feels believable, yet also a little bit absurd at times. I haven't read that much Kim Stanley Robinson, and I think using the word absurd to describe his writing might rub some people the wrong way. But they're both very technically proficient as well. Yeah, I other than the people we've already mentioned, I can't really think of anyone else. Although I'm sure that if I had read more widely than I have, then I would come up with more.
Any come to mind for you, Johan?
No, I think you pretty much covered it already, but I really like the idea of at least some sci-fi writers dig in, because not that I'm myself a big reader of not anymore, but you this feeling sometimes that there's a lot of world building, but there's not a lot for living, or people actually living in these worlds and experiencing them. So what I would really like was a real sci-fi novel, but with the attention to detail and actual lives in it. From Wallace kind of writing that would be good. That's the only thing I can add to this.
All right, so then the mapping the zone prescriptive reading plan for David Foster Wallace is read broadly across the 19th to 20th centuries in English, at least. Read Robert Caro's bibliography, and then you can read Infinite Jest.
I think you'll be in a good spot, yeah, if you do that.
I'm sure. And the final question that needs to be asked, because I think a few too many of those people that Luke in particular mentioned as needing to read Wallace's work might need to know the answer. If you read Infinite Jest, will it get you laid? Will it work with the ladies? Will it work with the fellas?
I would give a strong no. I'm sorry to say. It more works like a contraceptive in a way. And this is just because of the pretentiousness of the whole. Because the novel is now shrouded or whatever you say in pretentiousness, which is very unfortunate. Because it's not a pretentious novel. It's quite an honest novel, and it's an achievement and all that stuff. And of course, you couldn't call the show off and such, but I don't think it was. I think it was meant as an honest attempt at writing as good as he possibly could. But considering how time has changed and the book has become this almost hipster artifact, and there was this thing I mentioned with the which the actor Jason Segel mentions in an interview regarding his preparation for his role in the end of the tour, where he talks about going into a bookstore to buy a copy of Infinite Jest, and the girl at the counter just says something to the effect of yeah, that book, all my ex-boyfriends has an unread copy of that on their shelf. But I do think that if you're willing to give it the time of day, if you're willing to put in the effort to read it and actually, I'm not just plowing through it, but actually read it and trying to understand it and appreciate what the book is trying to do on almost anatomical level, and seeing how he works with language, with different kinds of ways of speaking, down to the Boston accent things in there, and all these different things he does. If you really put in the effort and read the whole thing and feel changed by it, both as a person and as a reader, I think you should get laid. I think there should be some, medal you can slap on your chest, and then there's a place you can go. I don't know how we should arrange it. Which is interesting because he mentions this doesn't he, in the I can't remember now the name. What was it called? Although of course you end up becoming yourself. The interview thing with Rolling Stone, but he wants to get laid of the book tour. Which he also mentioned, I think, in the movie. So yeah, I think you should, but you probably wouldn't. But again, this was most people who start to write because we hope we can play. If you're lucky, at some point you do, but not because you're a writer, just because you were in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I think I would agree 100% with Johan there. It almost certainly will not. But for some people, it is possible that if they learn something from the book and become a happier person or a better person in their interpersonal life, that may unintentionally lead them to getting laid. But no, I think largely, yeah, the book is much more of a contraceptive than it is anything else.
No, I mean, I do think that I have seen stuff on the internet that I don't necessarily subscribe to it being true, but it's stuff about how, if a guy has DeLillo and Pynchon and Wallace in his bookshelf and other authors like that that male is supposedly to be avoided, which I could see. As much as I love those authors and as much as I myself have a bunch of them on my bookshelf, I could see a certain type of guy, using those kind of authors for clout and stuff, and women wanting to avoid those types of men. And no, I don't think that, pretty much anyone, especially somebody who hasn't read Infinite Jest, is really going to be all that impressed that you've read it. And that there's a good chance that once they figure out that it's 1,200 pages, that they might think you're pretentious for bringing it up, for bragging about reading it. You might be viewed as bragging about how big the books are that you read and stuff. I wish we lived in a world where that wasn't true, but yeah, I mean, and I do understand where they're coming from, I think, but yeah.
I can say this from a positive perspective, as someone who has worked in the service industry a good chunk of her life. That the younger generation that is in high school and then currently is in college is sort of unaware of Infinite Jest and David Foster Wallace as the kind of hipster white male lit bro thing. So the sort of stigma doesn't necessarily exist as much with the younger generations currently. learning and going through education. So perhaps that will change in the future, Luke.
I'm currently imagining somebody just going through a first date, constantly talking about how long the books they read are. Yeah, no, I mean, what it sounds like is that the book, The Infinite Jest or The Pale King, or many of his collections of stories, might require some degree of self-actualization, and maybe to read them, it'll help many people actualize further. And in that sense, it may be beneficial, but it's probably not a big blue pill for anyone.
No, I don't. So.
Darn. Now, okay, well, I guess I'm not reading Infinite Jest.
Yeah, but if you want to get laid from reading books, you just read my books and then you're good to go.
Yeah, that makes
The
sense.
answers will just pour in. Aphrodisiac.
You do certainly have a better shot with a book that'll make someone laugh, like The Red Handler. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really into this book that's about the drudgery of everyday life and about how the moment to moment work of transactional analysis that the modern world has led us all to has really eroded sincerity in our lives. Take me now, they say.
Yep.
Yeah, but fill in this form first.
Speaking of which, Johan, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
My pleasure.
Talking about one of certainly my favorite author, but one of collectively the show's favorite authors. Did you have anything you wanted to throw out there to the audience as far as what those books are that you've written that they can have access to, or anything that you have going on or coming up soon?
No, not really. I think we should instead get people to back to the bonus episode we did. That I don't think I should impose on this bonus episode with advertising for my own stuff. But I'm just going through my notes to see if there was anything.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for listening. Hopefully this episode has convinced at least one person to read Infinite Jest. If not, the host on the episode that we were trying to convince to read Infinite Jest. And thank you as always for listening. We can be contacted at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We are also on both Twitter and Blue Sky at PinchOnPod. We are also on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast. And we are also available for any donations you may want to send our way. If you think our show's worth $1, we would love to have it. Any of that money is going to be used to upgrade equipment and pay hosting fees and any of the other sort of fiddly expenses that go into recording a podcast. We are on Ko-Fi at Mapping the Zone. And until next time, thank you all for listening.
See ya.
Bye.
Hi, thank you.